recording at this point. I'm not able to monitor the chat actively, so if you do have questions, they can wait to the end, or if there's an issue, maybe you can send a message to Francielle, who is the co-host for this session. Okay. So we mentioned before that the purpose of this seminar series is about language corpora. I'm hoping that the participants in this room today know what a corpus is, or at least you've heard of a corpus before, and maybe you're interested in the different applications or how you might be able to incorporate the use of these corpora into your education practice. And some of the applications that you might already be familiar with, the wide-ranging applications of corpora within the field of education, the field of applied linguistics generally, are shown here on this image. Corpora have been used to improve from a research perspective, of course, but then with education more generally, we think of materials preparation. All the major second language textbook producers or publishers these days, like Cambridge University Press, OUP, Macmillan, and so on, all have staff on hand who use corpora to help them to sequence and select the materials for their textbooks, whether for spoken or for written production. And they've been used for decades now. Not just materials, but entire kind of courses and syllabuses are based around the use of corpora, for example, academic syllabi, for example, or structuring of grammar or vocabulary type curricula. A great deal of applications of corpora have been used in the field of language testing, in particular Cambridge exams, IELTS scripts, for example. I myself have embedded corpus activities into the IELTS textbook materials that I produced with Cambridge University Press, for example, the Mindset series that came out a couple of years ago. And of course, corpora have been ubiquitous within lexicography for decades now. What I'm going to be focusing on today is where corpora can be used by teachers as well as learners. And I'm mainly talking about language learners, but not specifically. And I think one of the points that I'll make in today's talk is about broadening who is using corpora for what purpose. But essentially, the use of corpora for teaching and learning has been termed data-driven learning for 30 years now, since Tim Johns coined the term way back in 1990, 1991. Now, traditionally, and I use that word quite carefully here because I'm going to maybe critique some of the things that you can see here in this image. But traditionally, data-driven learning has used corpora following the different kind of elements that are seen here in this figure. So the data-driven learning and the use of corpora for teaching primarily has worked from the point of view that learners are exposed to data from a corpus in the form of concordance lines, where you will get the term that you search for, maybe in the middle of your screen, with some context to the left or the right. Based on the analysis of these concordances, data-driven learning is claimed to lead to increased vocabulary knowledge, higher order thinking, engagement in solving language-related problems, and together with peers and teachers, if they're using corpora together, they can work together to scaffold their inquiries into language using corpus data. So that's the traditional view. of data-driven learning, but primarily we're thinking about vocabulary as acquired through consultation of concordance lines through corpora. That's the traditional view, and one that almost all of the studies on data-driven learning to date, and there's been hundreds of such studies over the last 30 years, primarily that's the basic of what you're getting when you're involved in data-driven learning. So concordances, as you can see here in the right-hand image, where I'm hovering my mouse over here, I've searched for the word results in the corpus. So this is taken using the sketch engine platform. And then I've got a number of lines taken from the corpus data that contain the word results with some context around the search term. But increasingly, as the corpus tools increase in their development and they add different functions, as it gets better and better, we're able to extract other information from the corpus besides concordances, for example, the use of n-grams or chunks, formulaic language that is derived through corpus frequency. Through tools such as Lingual, we can develop visualizations which compare different queries against other potential results from the corpus so that learners can use this evidence to come to a conclusion when making a decision about which word to use in this case. And the latest tools, tools like Voyant tools, which I'll explain briefly in a moment, are doing away almost with concordance lines and having text and words be the main source of data, switching into more visual type representations of the data that are movable and clickable and extendable to allow learners an alternative way into the data to get to the answers that they need for the questions that they would like to have resolved. So, 30 years since Tim Jones coined the term data-driven learning to describe direct engagement with language corpus data, tools and techniques for pedagogical purposes, data-driven learning has become a very popular area of applied linguistics research, spawning several recent meta-analyses, syntheses, and surveys into its effectiveness for language learning across a wide range of teaching and learning contexts. Most of these syntheses have suggested that data-driven learning leads to a number of empirically proven benefits for learning, at least under pre- or post-test experimental conditions, notably for vocabulary, English for academic purposes, and second language writing is where most of the studies have been conducted. In a recent synthesis of these syntheses, Anne O'Keefe, the University of Limerick, notes that the studies and the meta-analyses and surveys have each pointed towards the value of data-driven learning, together with a so-called undying enthusiasm about data-driven learning as an aid to learning, as well as an aspiration that DDL should become more mainstream. So, if everything is going as well as these syntheses suggest, then why hasn't DDL yet achieved these grand aspirations? In our second order synthesis of these syntheses, the findings so far point to the following major issues for the field. Firstly, a lack of a real definition of the theoretical underpinnings of data-driven learning. A crucial issue, for example, is determining data-driven learning's place within, say, the weak or strong interface theories on implicit or explicit learning. In line with much core research, and indeed applied linguistics research, the theoretical bases underlying many DDL studies are often missing, or at best seem to be tacked on post facto to frame the study. Secondly, a lack of DDL studies focusing on the impact of DDL at the cognitive level, alongside purported, but as yet rarely directly tested, improvements to learner autonomy, language awareness, noticing, and more. Thirdly, a general lack of information on the training provided in the use of corpus tools and integration of DDL into classroom practice and syllabus design in major studies. Also, a prevalence of studies with the researcher or the applied linguist as the main stakeholder rather than the teachers or the students and institutions. Next, we see an over-reliance on concordancing and frequency information from public or locally compiled corpora at the expense of other software, data, and corpus types. In addition, a need for DDL studies with learners and tertiary students, especially for English. This includes younger learners at primary, secondary levels, but also outside initial education and in professional contexts. Further work is needed to see also if English is a special case for DDL or whether it's also appropriate for other languages. And finally here, a lack of methodological rigor in data collection, analysis, instruments, and methods, preventing replication, often coupled with poor reporting practices for methodology, including context, proficiency, duration, and what the learners actually did. However, this is not exclusive to DDL, but applies to many studies in SLA and applied linguistics as a whole. So, with my, as I mentioned before, deliberately provocative title, is the current field of DDL dead? We certainly recognize the value of the previous 30 years research in getting us where we are today. However, there is a suspicion that research, zombie-like, is covering well-trod paths rather than breaking substantial new ground. This leaves DDL in danger of never truly breaking into the mainstream. In this paper presentation, then, I present a number of useful DDL studies and initiatives that have the potential to reanimate the field, demonstrating the kind of outside-the-box thinking required if DDL is to remain a viable pedagogical approach over the next 30 years of research. So as I mentioned previously, one of the major problems with the field of DDL to date is that there is a lack of a theoretical underpinning of DDL in terms of learning theories, what is actually going on as learners are engaged in corpus consultation. By way of example, a recent concordance study we did of recent journal papers on DDL finds only 11 concordances within our data set that contain the word theoretical, theories, or theory within them. As Vatkina and Boulton in 2021 note, an approach survives on its merits or works because it doesn't, regardless of theory. But this does leave us rather hungry for more. The impression we are left with is that many studies begin with a class and an objective, fill it in with some DDL, and then write up what happened. Most DDL studies in the field point to constructivism as the main learning paradigm under which DDL operates, where engagement with corpus data results in students' consolidation of multiple forms of information to arrive at data-driven conclusions when testing their hypotheses about language use. However, as Anne O'Keefe in 2020 rightly pointed out, this focus on constructivist learning at the individual level has come at the expense of other paradigms under which learning may occur. The example you can see here on the slide is that of sociocultural benefits of DDL when implemented in actual classroom practice and aided with peer or teacher-provided scaffolding during focus on form activities. However, you rarely see this in DDL studies, as the vast majority of the studies that you see are focused at the individual level on constructivist, of the learner doing the work, of the learner developing their autonomy in the act of corpus consultation. But we very rarely see what is going on in classrooms where peers and teachers are engaged in corpus consultation together, where they're taking part in guided learning, where they're taking part in activities that are teacher designed and how they're engaging with those. So the overemphasis on constructivism as the sole learning paradigm under which DDL operates is a little outdated. Note also that constructivist approaches to learning, such as DDL, often require considerable inductive reasoning skills. And that means that students that have been raised in educational systems favoring more deductive or teacher-led reasoning may struggle with DDL and even personally reject it as a viable approach. And in my experience, I found that many students do just that. At the cognitive level, it also tends to be assumed rather than tested that DDL encourages noticing, pattern recognition, exemplar-driven learning, acquisition through frequency and statistical information, recognition of the psycholinguistic reality of chunks and collocations, input flood, deeper cognitive processing, and so on. Positive results from various studies are taken to confirm this, but the evidence is generally indirect rather than the focus of the research itself. For example, one of the more popular paradigms in DDL is Schmidt's noticing hypothesis. Typically in these studies, corpus consultation is successful. Therefore, noticing has happened. And this is taken as evidence that DDL fits perfectly. But where is the actual evidence that the noticing occurred? And to date, we don't have many studies, if at all, that have really shown where and when and how that noticing occurs. The link between DDL and noticing is often positioned together with theories of usage-based learning, with DDL helping learners to internalize statistical information about language in use in the form of frequency and collocation information from corpus data. However, the development of actual cognitive abilities arising from DDL is not represented in the body of research examined, according to Pascal Perez-Paredes' recent survey. And Anne O'Keefe's second-order analysis in 2020 states that while DDL is likely to lead to improvements in a range of cognitive processes, the link has seldom been tested empirically. And we would agree. One of the issues is that there is a relative dearth of follow-up studies determining if DDL has led to sustained learning outcomes, as well as almost no studies determining if improved learning practices post-DDL have been realized by the same learners in other language-related or even non-language related domains. It seems intuitive that DDL ought to lead to more effective learning or even better learners in general. But the relative lack of longitudinal research designs leaves this claim as yet empirically unverified. But this is not a trivial point. Given the time-consuming nature of DDL, especially in the early stages of a given intervention, and we all know how tricky it is if you've ever tried to implement a DDL practice within your own classrooms, like the learning curve is really quite intense, depending on what you're doing and who you're doing it with. But given the amount of effort involved, if there are no long-term benefits beyond that intervention, then the entire enterprise may be based on very shaky foundations. What is needed are studies that look at more general trends, such as whether DDL actually improves critical thinking or language awareness, among others. So, another major issue here for DDL as a field is that in many of the reported studies to date, information on the form, approach, and content of the actual DDL training conducted with students and/or trainee teachers or whoever is taking the intervention is still lacking. One issue is many studies generally include small participant samples only for short durations of time because of its Basically, you've got your researcher, and the researcher has managed to convince some lucky people that they're going to take part in DDL. However, this is not unique to DDL, but is typical of computer-assisted language learning research as a whole. Another issue is many studies often fail to appropriately describe the actual DDL training regimen that took place, with vague descriptions such as a training session was given to the participants with a video tutorial demonstrating how to consult Coca. This is taken from a recently published study, and unfortunately that's the extent of information that we get from that study about what the training actually involved. Information on exactly what students were asked to do, how they engage with the selected resources, how they interacted with others to achieve lesson objectives, and what the teacher's role in all of this was, is often incomplete, or, at the worst case situation, completely unavailable. Similarly, information on the duration of DDL treatment may be reported in terms of single sessions, minutes, hours, weeks, months, semesters, or years, making comparison across different studies incredibly difficult. For example, a semester's course may feature 2 3-hour classes over 15 weeks, or just a few minutes in occasional classes over a handful of weeks. This is a tremendous difference. Without knowing what took place and how long it took place for, we are therefore no closer to finding out what actually works and what doesn't. Another issue is the difficulty involved in tracking what learners are actually doing during the active corpus consultation for DDL. Most attempts at tracking are limited to observation, where the researcher is just watching the person do the corpus consultation, or self-reports from students or learners via questionnaires or interviews. A very small number of more ambitious studies, for example, Pascal Perez-Paredes in 2011 and my own study in 2019, have tracked offline measures of corpus use, including the tracking of corpus query syntax. The diagram that you can see here, for example, is based on a corpus platform that I developed at the University of Hong Kong, which was used for graduate thesis writing courses across all the different faculties of the university. And we were able to track which kind of faculty was using different corpus functions. So what we found was that those in the sciences were tending to use more statistical kind of outputs and consulting those. So things like diagrams and charts and frequency and number information, whereas those from the arts tended to use more textual information, so going in and reading the concordance lines and in detail and trying to extract the information that they needed from those. So clear disciplinary differences there in who is using the corpus for what. However, despite those studies, online measures of what learners are actually doing during DDL, such as eye tracking, keystroke logging, or even magnetic imaging, brain scanning procedures, there are no studies yet done on that. It's something that we talked a lot at the last Teaching a Language corporate conference, but hopefully those studies are ongoing, but to date, we haven't been able to see any such study. However, there are a number of really good studies out there that do explain and have really good pedagogical practice and descriptions of what is actually happening during the DDL interventions. These include the famous works of Kennedy and Michelli for the teaching and learning of Italian. That was conducted here in Australia. Their description of pattern hunting and pattern refining strategies for DDL instruction have resulted in a wealth of later studies adopting these techniques. Another really good example is the work of Cynthia Quinn in 2015 in the English Language Teaching Journal, I believe it is. And that study provides a very detailed 6-stage approach that you can see here to students' corpus training for improving second language writing, including introducing corpora as a concept at the first stage, explaining the reasons why a corpus should be used at stage 2, some paper-based concordancing at the 3rd stage, online corpus practice at the 4th stage, some response to written corrective feedback at later stages, and making revisions to students' text using the corpus at the final stage. So really taking them through what a corpus is, why you would want to use it, and this very guided and scaffolded approach about how you can use Corpora to improve your writing. Although it must be said that Quinn had an entire semester with these students, weekly sessions, and it was a really very involved process, but maybe this is something that just having this and being able to sequence and stage the data-driven learning intervention and the tasks in this way is really incredibly useful. We also have Tony McHenry and colleagues' 3 I's, namely illustration, interaction, and induction, or similar to like a PPP approach to what you would be doing, but this time with a corpus. With Lynn Flowerdew in 2009 proposing the 4th I, that of intervention, where you're actually going to go ahead and do something with the corpus data hands-on. So these are some examples of studies over the past couple of decades that have commented on pedagogical practice and are really good examples to follow. From the teacher's perspective, information on how DDL was introduced to them and how it was integrated or not into their classroom practice is also crucial if the field is to develop expertise and popularity in this area, although this data is often missing from DDL studies. That said, a number of recent studies are beginning to reveal new insights into how DDL can be incorporated into teacher training. Examples include Schaefer-LaCroix in my own book, the Data-Driven Learning for Younger Learners volume, who provides a detailed description of the successes and failures regarding the training of French teachers of second language German to develop a corpus-based language learning activity, noting first-order barriers related to trainees' technical abilities, accompanied by second-order and more serious barriers related to trainees' conceptions of Corpora and DDL as a viable pedagogical approach. Other useful studies involve Agnieszka Lenko-Szymanska, who's going to be presenting within this seminar series, in her 2017 study, who analyzed 53 corpus-based projects submitted by teacher trainees following DDL training, determining whether the trainees had acquired the technical skills required to perform their own corpus analyses, and whether these skills were sufficient to inform their teaching, and whether they'd acquired the pedagogical skills to enable them to exploit Corpora in the classroom. It was found that despite demonstrating mastery of the software and DDL for their own purposes, the trainees were reported as still lacking the skills to integrate their use within classroom practice. A very recent study by Ching Ma this year is in Call is a very useful study in this area, presenting a DDL-focused teacher training intervention, documenting changes in teachers' pedagogical content knowledge, also known as PCK. From comprehension of subject matter and corpora and corpus tools, to transformation, including pedagogical practice, including materials preparation, selection of the tools, and adaptation to meet students' characteristics and needs. I also have a similar study currently under review with the Call Journal focusing on TPAC, which is similar to that of PCK, but includes more technical, the combination of a technical content knowledge to form what's called technological pedagogical content knowledge for TPAC. And I did a study on that recently in the Indonesian context, charting changes in teachers' TPAC following DDL training sessions. It's important to frame DDL training within established theories of teacher knowledge in education, such as PCK and TPAC, because doing so helps to increase buy-in from those within the education field who have the means and leverage to engage with schools and other institutions to get such training embedded within a wider range of professional development contexts, both within and outside of applied linguistics and computer-assisted language learning. So this is a way we can frame DDL within these kind of educational knowledge paradigms. We increase buy-in, potential buy-in from stakeholders from outside of applied linguistics, and that's something that we really have to do. I already mentioned that an additional but equally important problem is that in the vast majority of the teacher training interventions reported for DDL so far, the corpus linguist, i.e. people like me, are the people who are the main stakeholders in the introduction and the eventual success of DDL within a given teaching learning context. In particular, Angela Chambers' study in 2019 reveals what she terms a research practice gap, where language teachers who are not researchers find it difficult to replicate a given corpus intervention when the applied linguist has left the building. Van der Viana and Liu in 2021, and Van der Viana is going to be the next speaker in this seminar series coming up next week, also note the value of engagement with Corpora through continuing professional development projects in what he calls democratizing access to DDL for both language-oriented and non-language-oriented academics and professionals alike. Essentially, we need to expand the target audience for DDL beyond tertiary language learners and their academics to include a more diverse audience, investigating DDL for professional practice, private tutoring, language schools, business, and more, as and when the actual need arises. We could even go further by encouraging teachers of other disciplines to use corpus tools when dealing with any type of electronic text for any purpose. In this way, corpus tools might have a chance of becoming a reflex go-to resource rather than a specialist tool that is returned to the metaphorical dusty shelf when the immediate need is overcome, never to be thought of again. One very promising direction lies in the use of open educational resources for DDL, where structured activities built around specific corpus applications for specific corpora and are suitable for non-experts in corpus linguistics can be shared freely online for teacher-student DDL training. Most training materials to date usually take the form of standalone PDF files, meaning teachers must go back and forth between reading these materials and searching corpora online, according to Nina Vatkina in her paper in 2020. More tailored, specific resources must therefore be made available to professionalize any training that is to take place. Useful examples include my own short private online course, Improving Writing Through Corpora. And again, if you go through the recording of today's presentation, you'll be able to see the URLs there. And of course, if you send me an email, I'll be able to provide a list of these upon request. This course takes participants through the basics of corpus queries and interpreting corpus data using the SCEL and Sketch Engine online tools. Over 800 participants have taken the course to date across 65 countries, while Portuguese and Mandarin language translations of the course content have already been completed. The project incorporating Corpora mentioned in Vatkina 2020 boasts a suite of open educational resources dedicated to DDL for second language German. So again, this is something that you should check out if that's the language that you're trying to acquire. Vincent and Nessie's BAWE Quick Clicks project provides a suite of language learning activities targeting common issues with second language academic writing, with additional pre-selected URL links to concordances within the BAWE corpus. So basically, they focus on common errors that second language learners are having with their academic writing, and they provide links that take learners straight to the corpus data without the learners having to come up with the query under their own steam. And a very recent creation is that of Ellen LaFoll's open educational resource book, creating corpus-informed materials for the English as a foreign language classroom, which is a wonderful resource that is available to us. This contains materials developed by and for teacher trainees, again using freely available corpus resources with materials for primary, secondary, and tertiary language learners. In each case, these materials aim to reduce the need for a corpus linguist to deliver DDL training, although of course it will take greater promotion of these resources within and outside of the corpus linguistics community if teachers and institutions are to realize their potential. One area where there's been undoubted improvement over the last decade is the availability of accessible corpora, user-friendly corpus query tools, and even online tools, allowing for DIY corpora to be uploaded for processing, accompanied by a range of query and visualization options. For example, what a lot of people are using at the moment is Buoyant Tools, where you can upload your own text and your own corpora and reveal concordances and a range of different visualization options. However, the majority of DDL studies so far still report using tools that, while excellent research applications, may be poor choices for language teaching and learning or for ordinary users. This may be due to one or a combination of the following. Firstly, the level of technical knowledge needed to use the tool may be above that what the teachers or the learners can do. You have to be aware that there are a wide range of skill levels, and I've done teacher training sessions with teachers before who couldn't even get corpus data files from a zip drive. Like, they didn't know how to copy the files from the zip drive to their computer for use in the corpus query platform. So that's a major issue. Other software may have complex login procedures or may require an expensive license to use. An additional problem is complicated or unintuitive user interfaces at odds with how modern learners typically access digital information through resources such as Google. Unsuitable corpus data for the target learners is a perennial problem, and I've reviewed numerous papers and examined even full PhD theses that are guilty of this. For example, using the COCA for younger or less proficient second language learners. However, this is not a problem with the data, but it's a problem with the researcher's choice. But we see it in a lot of DDL studies. And as I already mentioned, most DDL studies have an overwhelming focus on concordances as the sole model of input and data visualization. Today's learners exist within a digital world, and while the concept of digital natives has been criticized for its simplistic assumptions that modern learners come equipped with the requisite digital literacy and management skills required to navigate this world, what we do know is that accessing digital language content is something that virtually all learners are now used to, with language input in digital forms from a wide range of sources, including online games, social media, chat software, and multimodal subtitles. DDL, when it was originally proposed, was intended to cut out the middleman, with the middleman in this case being the teacher. It was cutting out the middleman between the learner and the data. However, we argue here, in many classroom contexts, this cutting out the middleman has already happened, sparking a change from learners being taught to having the tools at their disposal to teach themselves, with the teacher guiding this process. But they are only likely to transfer these practices if DDL tools evolve to accommodate the ways that learners are used to sourcing information, rather than DDL practitioners trying to force learners to adopt concordancing with limited left-right context provided and/or an overwhelming range of query options to choose from. Certainly in my experience, I feel that DDL approaches where concordances are the start and finish of DDL pedagogy may need to be replaced with complementary methods of linguistic analysis if DDL is ever going to gain a foothold in mainstream education. Useful studies expanding the boundary of DDL in this way, including a work by Fanny Mounier in 2019, discussing the use of a website with film and TV clips aligned between subtitles and video. For example, the Play Phrase Me tool. I don't have time to much to go into, but you're able to find phrases in here within movie videos and to see the query term in context and to be able to share that and to play with that. An additional tool also mentioned in that study is lyrics training, where you can learn languages through music now on your smartphone. So essentially what these is that they're encouraging DDL-like engagement with language data, but without necessarily a concordance in sight. In both cases, the textual data available from learners' queries are supported by multimedia clips which are available in a wide range of languages. On the other hand, dedicated online language learning applications such as one of my favorite tools at the moment, Lingle, as well as a tool that I only recently discovered a few weeks ago called Flax, are changing the nature of corpus queries and query output to make them easier, more intuitive, and more informational. Corpus applications embedded into word processors, such as Anna Frankenberg-Garcia and colleague Collocate platform, are making promising inroads into classroom practice in a number of contexts, in this case for help with collocations and phrasing in academic writing. Corpus applications are also being combined with natural language processing technology, such as the software GRubric, which I've seen mentioned in some papers at the recent Eurocall 2021 conference, which can provide automated written corrective feedback for revision of learner texts, extracting specialized lexis that the student may or may not have used through comparison with corpus-based model answers. So all really useful initiatives that are encouraging data-driven learning, but without necessarily through the use of a concordancer. As important as the tools, the nature of the corpus data itself should also be subject to change in response to the needs of its learners. One way is to make Corpora more accessible through the use of graded readers or simplified text. Another data type that relates directly to the learner's experience is language produced by them. And learner corpora for DDL is an area that is seriously underexplored. Also, proprietary web crawling software such as Bootcat can allow learners and their teachers to generate corpora by entering a few simple keywords into the software, and then a corpus will be automatically generated from the web by Wikipedia or pre-selected web pages. One issue sometimes, as I mentioned, is that the corpus data may not be suitable for particular learners. I mean, I've been working with secondary school girls here in Australia, and I had a number of issues even with the British Academic Written English corpus where I've asked them to search for collocations of verbs, and they've come up with results that are not meant for children. So an innovation which again was mentioned at the Eurocall conference is that of crowdsourced corpora, where teachers can flag text within a corpus as problematic, and then that text can be filtered if necessary. In addition, truly pedagogic corpora designed with teaching in mind, such as Sarkodel and Backbone, which is hosted on the University of Tübingen's website. These corpora are specifically designed with particular learners and learning goals in mind, but unfortunately, we don't have that many such resources, and more funding and more maintenance of these resources is required if they're ever going to gain more mainstream or more popularity. So to conclude my talk today, the title of the paper was deliberately provocative. I mean, I'm one of the probably biggest champions of DDL. So for somebody like me to come out and ask if DDL is dead is kind of getting the way that I feel about the current field of research, and myself and Alex Boulton, kind of the co-author of this paper, are in agreement on this. We feel that DDL is definitely not dead, as witnessed by the increasing number of research publications over time. Nonetheless, there's a feeling that we could be doing more to bring it into the mainstream where that is warranted. And it's not always warranted. I mean, we're not saying that DDL is going to be a solution for everybody's problems, but that its implementation depends on local conditions and immediate and long-term goals for teaching and individuals. DDL research may be treading water, but there's plenty of scope for innovation if we only take a step back and look at new possibilities without the blinkers of dogmatic reflexes, such as that isn't DDL. Just checking my time, and I realize I'm running over a little bit, so I'm just going to ask kind of these questions, a general set for the audience here. Since many learners are already using various tools in various ways that are not entirely dissimilar to DDL, such as some of the tools I showed you a moment ago, how can we encourage that and help the learners to do it better for the purposes of data-driven learning? So that's something that is a question that, I mean, this goes back to a follow-up study I've just done with these secondary school learners that I'm doing in Australia. I've just written back to them and said, are you still using the Corpus software that I've showed you? And 50% said, yes, I'm still using it. The other 50 said no. And I asked them, okay, so what are you doing? And they said, I'm using Google. And that is something that, if I'm losing 50% of my participants each time to Google, then I need to come up with a way to introduce data-driven learning mindset into their Google consultation. So what I don't want for them, for example, is to go to Google and then just click on the first link that comes up and say, oh, that's the right answer. What I want them to do is to take an application like Google, apply a DDL mindset to their consultation of the data they receive from that, rather than expecting them necessarily to come to corpus linguistics. So how can we do that? How can we bring that DDL mindset to our learners without going through the hard fight of trying to persuade them that corpus linguistics is great and it's going to solve a lot of their problems? In addition, how can links be made between DDL and other materials? So not just focusing on the corpus as this kind of standalone thing, but how can we make better links between what we're doing with DDL and the materials, for example, textbooks, the internet, as well as the different skills that they'll be mastering in the classroom. For example, speaking, there's very few studies on DDL for improving speaking or working out how to integrate DDL into productive skills like speaking, but also receptive skills as well. Like, can it improve reading or listening? There's very little research on that, with the vast majority of it being done on, say, grammatical items or second language writing. And how can we keep DDL fun? Avoiding stigmatization of DDL as dry and mechanical, which it certainly is when it's done badly. And I've seen a number of interventions, I've read a number of papers as well, or reviewed papers, where you just think, well, nobody's ever going to go for this because it's just it's a slog. It's dry, it's mechanical, it's not fun. It's turning the learners off, and they're reverting to Google or their Duolingo or whatever it is as their go-to resource for language learning. So I already mentioned the things there on the recommendations, so I am aware of the time, but I do just want to give a final message to say that DDL is not dead. It's had a varied and distinguished history over the past 30 years, but I think it's up to all of us to make sure that we do as much as we can to make sure that that continues, and we can do that by hopefully taking some of the recommendations and using some of the wonderful resources that I've been able to outline to you here today. So thanks for listening to my talk. I just want to plug the next talk next Friday at the same time with Dr. Van der Viana at the University of East Anglia, UK, and he'll be discussing the interface between corpus linguistics and English for academic purposes. We will, it says Zoom link will be sent out soon. For that one, we're going to ask you to register, and I will be sending out the registration link through the same channels that I advertise this course, as well as our Brazilian partners and European partners will also be trying to share that registration link this time around as well. So, so do look out for that. So that's the end of my talk, and then here I'm going to stop the recording so that I'm able to take on questions.